Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. We're thrilled to have one of our favorite returning guests with us today, author Beth Caruso, who's been instrumental in growing awareness of the witch hunt of Alice Young and other victims.
Alice Young was New England's first documented witch trial victim, executed in 1647. Due to the change from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar that was happening at that time, her actual death date would be June 5th by our modern calendar, where it was recorded as May 26th by the old calendar. But for centuries, her story was nearly lost.
Then, in May of 2023, Connecticut finally cleared her name with a bipartisan legislative vote.
Beth's investigations and writings are a passionate tribute demonstrating that Alice Young's life in Windsor is Connecticut heritage. Her ties to the local families and colonial settlers are significant to understanding the colony itself.
Today we'll discuss Alice's lasting legacy through her descendants and what still needs to be done to honor her memory. Welcome back to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, author Beth Caruso. Please tell our listeners about your accomplishments from bringing more light to Connecticut's history of the witch trials.
Hi, it's so good to be back with both of you. I love your podcast. I love visiting with people on it. And as far as accomplishments, gosh, that's a little embarrassing because as far as getting more people informed about the Connecticut witch trials, it's, a whole group of people, not just me. I guess my part in this is working to do research on Alice Young because she is a person who was from my town, the very first one in the New England colonies to hang for witchcraft. And that bothered me that people didn't know more about her. And that's what prompted the research into Alice Young. Along the way, I've learned more about Lydia Gilbert, also a Connecticut witch trial victim from Windsor, and hooked up with wonderful people like you two who do even more to get the word out about the Connecticut witch trials. So I started with really just learning at first about Alice Young, who she's from my town, and along the way discovered that there were others interested in this. Tony Grigo, for one, had tried to get exoneration along with many others in the state of Connecticut years earlier. So, I got involved with him to get an exoneration in Windsor, Connecticut in 2017 for our two witch trial victims with the town council. And what really helped get it going was the research that I did about Alice Young, which turned into a novel because I wanted people to really, understand who she was from the heart as much as I could convey that. I also have an academic article out with Dr. Catherine Hermes. We capitalized on the initial research I did into Alice Young and wrote a more lengthy article about connections to later trials, this very first case, which we can go into a little bit more. But once I started writing, that book is One of Windsor. And that's this one.
I'm also pointing to my new hardback copy right back there.
From there, I had such a great amount of material from that and so much research done, that it turned into a second novel, The Salty Rose, and that largely talks about John Winthrop Jr. and how he stopped the witch trials in Connecticut, as well as the Hartford witch panic and some stuff going on in New Amsterdam at the time because there was a woman who was accused of witchcraft in Hartford who was Dutch. Finally, I wrote Between Good and Evil, which is the story about Alice Young Jr., who would have witnessed the accusation of Lydia Gilbert, because surprisingly, she was still in Windsor at the time. And what she had to go through, she escaped by marrying someone and went to Springfield, Massachusetts. But the stain of witchcraft lingered with her, and people viewed her differently. The article, as far as that accomplishment, in Connecticut History Review, and I'm trying to get to it here. It's called Between God and Satan, and it's about Thomas Thornton, he was actually the father of children that died while they lived right next door to Alice Young during an influenza epidemic. And then, as far as other accomplishments, working with you two and Tony Grigo, Mary Bingham, and many others to get exoneration passed on this date, actually 2 years ago, right around this time in the Connecticut state legislature. Just working with various people and to trying to bring forward this history. Because, hey, a lot of people didn't know about it. Hopefully more do now, but I think still even more need to know.
It's so great to be talking to you about Alice Young again. This goes all the way back to our first episode when we were called Thou Shalt Not Suffer. We talked with you and Tony Grigo about the Connecticut witch trials, and you first informed our audience about Alice Young and her execution being the first in the colonies. And why is it that we're talking about her right now, today?
Well, we're talking about her today because tomorrow is the day that we tend to recognize Alice Young, May the 26th, 1647. But that was a Julian year. It's easier to commemorate her on that day since that's the date known. Most people don't realize that when you convert from the Julian calendar to our calendar today, which is the Gregorian calendar, her death date would probably be June 5th because it goes forward 11 days. It was interesting in colonial times because if you were traveling from New England into New Amsterdam, the days would change by 11.
Wow.
So, it
Wow.
could be confusing. Going back to Alice Young, why talk about her so much? Beside it being an anniversary, she was also the first one to hang, and that really opened up the witch trials. That gave the okay that, hey, we're fine with this. We're fine hanging people who we think are witches. And there was a lot that built up to that. They were in a new place, even though witch hunting had been traditionally done in both England and in Europe. This was the first time in, quote, I'm saying quotes with this, the New World, that someone had hanged in the colonies. And with doing that, it gave permission for people to hang witches when they thought witches were in their midst. Just a few years before, they started laws in both Connecticut and Massachusetts that prescribed hanging. And this was from the Bible. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, which is how you got your first podcast name, right?
Yeah.
So we have to talk about her and her case because what happened with her helped to set up patterns later on, not just give permission for it to happen. And that whole trajectory, which started in Windsor, Connecticut, built up to the first 7 cases in Connecticut, which were brutal. All of those led to hanging. Then there was some moderation that came in with John Winthrop Jr. testifying at witch trials. There were a few cases in Massachusetts at that time as well. And then you have the Hartford witch panic where everything went haywire again. I would say that was probably the kind of the middle of the witch trial history in New England anyway. And then you have more individual cases. In Connecticut, by the way, those hangings from the Hartford witch panic, those stopped in 1662, 63. Those were the last ones in Connecticut, even though there were witch trials that continued. But in Massachusetts, 30 years later, you end up with the Salem witch trials. And, many reasons, again, how they came about. But there may have been an influence because of witch trials got going already as a way to handle fearful situations. But also, there was someone who Dr. Hermes and I wrote the article about, Thomas Thornton, who was right next door to Alice Young in 1647, the year she was accused and hanged, and ends up in Cotton Mather's Church in Boston in 1692. He's a retired minister by that point. And you find him also, according to Robert Califf, at the bedside of Margaret Rule at Cotton Mather's house. Margaret Rule was somebody who had been bewitched, and she was supposedly there to heal at Cotton Mather's home. It's important to talk about Alice. First of all, she was an innocent person. All these people were innocent. But second of all, I think it's important to talk about her to bring in the overall history and understand the overall history a little bit better.
Yeah. And we also have something really amazing that happened 2 years ago, which is her exoneration. And when we talk about the exoneration, it really wasn't something that happened overnight. It was an accumulation of efforts. But that last battle, if we call it, really is an amazing story. And that was 2 years ago today.
Yeah.
This weekend. Yeah.
I think exactly 2 years ago today, we were all with each other in the state legislature in the Senate, and we were watching them debate. And I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was a little bit before 5 o'clock, they introduced this resolution to recognize Connecticut's witch trial victim. They changed the wording to absolution. So I'm not sure this is our final thing within the Connecticut state legislature. Exoneration is truly more appropriate because absolution implies that you're being forgiven for something that you've done wrong. And these witch trial victims did absolutely nothing wrong. Let's just be clear about that. Not to be hanged for witchcraft, And, exoneration implies you haven't done anything wrong. You were wrongfully convicted. So, nonetheless, we still call it exoneration because engine, right? In this resolution, there's so much that had never been done before that's so important. The victims got named. There was an apology by the state. And I explained to people who are like, we weren't there. Why are people now apologizing? And I explained to them, it's an apology in the same way that you would say you're sorry to someone when you attend a funeral. You go up to the loved ones and you say, I'm so sorry. These are my condolences. This was something very, very important, I think, for descendants, us especially, but I think for anyone who's interested in justice, it was an important thing to happen.
And as you mentioned, the names, it is really historic because if somebody knows that their ancestor was accused in court in Connecticut, they can know that their ancestor's name is in this resolution. Everybody that is known to the state was included.
Absolutely. And that's so important because these victims do not have graves that we know of. We have no idea where they finally were laid to rest. Yeah, I think it's important that we have that resolution in place. And I think it's important now that we do have that in place to continue to figure out other ways we can commemorate these victims and recognize them. And certainly the stories, whether they're through novels or lectures, there's another novel by Catherine Spada Bastow. She's since passed on, but she writes about the Hartford witch panic. She's also written about Catherine Harrison, another person who almost hanged for witchcraft, but luckily she had to flee to escape being hanged and being convicted. But she suffered a lot too. And that book is also available too. So there are many different ways, but what hasn't happened in Connecticut yet, which I hope will happen soon, is that there be a permanent historical display about these Connecticut victims and about this whole trajectory of what happened with the witch trials, how they started in Windsor. The trial itself was probably in Hartford, but the accusations started in Windsor. So how we went from that all the way to Salem, certainly the focus would be Connecticut. And why don't you hear about Connecticut so much? A lot of that is because we had John Winthrop Jr., who actually ended up slowing down the witch trials a lot and stopped the hangings because he advised for a two-person rule. In those days, people could hang on spectral evidence alone. And so with a two-person rule under him, it was decided that you couldn't have just one person saying, "Oh, and so pinched me in my sleep and she made me sick." There had to be another person. And of course, there never was, which is why witch trials slowed down in Connecticut. That's very, very important too. So I hope we will have a permanent exhibit one day. And as I mentioned earlier, these victims have no grave. There are many, many descendants. There's nowhere for them to pay their respects. There's a couple bricks here and there, a plaque on a rock here and there in different towns. But as far as a memorial for all of them, we really don't have that. So I hope we do one day.
It's so important for people to have a place that they can go and commemorate this tragedy and also learn about the history. And it's so important to tell all of these stories of the individual human beings that were involved, like Alice Young. You had mentioned that her neighbor had some children die the same year that she was hanged. Is that possibly why she was targeted?
Yeah. So going back to Alice as the focus, I tried to figure out what was going on in that situation. Historians had speculated for a while that there were probably deaths related to her witchcraft accusation. And Indeed, in the year 1647, there was an influenza epidemic. There were 27, not including Alice, who died, compared to just 6 the previous year. Most of those mentioned in the Matthew Grant record are specified as children. Some of them not specified, I know, are children just from studying early Windsor. And so this was a disease that claimed a lot of child victims, and Puritans were extremely protective of their children. Family life was the center of their life. And so when this pandemic came along, it wiped out a lot of people, mostly children. Now, how did that relate to Alice Young? What no one had done before was try and figure out where these deaths were. So I found an old map by James Hammond Trumbull in a History of Hartford County book. So I looked at Backer Row and I recreated it because the years that he had for that map were just a range of dates. It wasn't a specific date. So I looked at 1647 specifically and realized, oh, okay, well, maybe if I figure out who the owners were of each property, I can maybe figure out what was going on. Also, in the Matthew Grant Diary, which was called the Old Windsor Church Record originally, there were vital statistics in there: births, death, some marriages. There's not a lot of records in there, but luckily we do have them for 1647. And lo and behold, by figuring out Backer Row at least, and some other areas in Windsor, I could piece together where people lived who had died, who were listed in that Matthew Grant Diary. And of course, lo and behold, on Backer Row, I see Alice. She's living on a property that was sold to her by a tinker family member. And all on either side of her, they're tinkers all up the street. But that's the women's name. They were all sisters, and Alice was in the middle of them. But they were called Sension Hubbard because they took on their husband's names. So that's why you see different names. But if you look at Backer Row during this influenza epidemic, 1647, you see that a lot of the child deaths, at least 5, maybe 6, are on Backer Row. And it was a pretty short street. Today, it's just a driveway. It's not a through street anymore. Used to go to Old Kennedy Road in Windsor. But Miss Sarah Sension, she's a child. She lives right next door to the Thorntons. She dies. Then of the Thorntons, we know of 3 children named by Matthew Grant. And then there's a 4th child who just disappears from the records altogether after that. So we don't know for sure, but it's quite probable that this last child, Samuel, died also at that time, which wiped out, I think he had 5 going on 6. His wife Anne was pregnant at the time, but for the Thornton family, Thomas Thornton, the father, that meant that family lost 2/3 of their children. It was a big cluster, what you call cluster in epidemiology. And Alice Young lived right next door. She just had 1 child, and her child, Alice Jr., lived. And we know she lived because we have her marriage record. We have some stories about her. So, that puts Alice in a very difficult predicament if there's other factors that could have worked against her. Now, other factors that might have worked against her, and I don't know that necessarily it was Thomas Thornton pointing the finger and saying, she's a witch. I don't know that for sure, but there could be anyone in town saying, wait a minute, isn't this weird? Look at all these children. They died right next to her. And most of the deaths are on Backer Row, right where she is. How come her one child lives and all these other children die? You never know exactly who or how these rumors start, which is why it is a loss that we don't have the actual trial records. And this is, definitely not as good as having those specific records. But it gets us at least a lot closer to understanding why this could have happened. So, anyway, Alice, I think because of where she is, where she and John Young are on Backer Row, there's all these Tinker family people and them. All these people left like right after the epidemic. So it leads you to believe, could Alice have been related to all these people or her husband? Could her husband have been related? And we know that they were from an area called Windsor. What's the town called now? Windsor. I don't know how it went to being called Windsor because it was called something else initially. And most of the settlers in Windsor at that time were not from central England, near Windsor, or from London area. They were from the southwest of England. So that may have been a factor too. The other thing that I think may have been a factor, and again, I don't have absolute final concrete information on this because no trial records and some vital statistics is missing as far as marriage record for John and Alice Young and for the birth of Alice Young Jr. So anyway, I think, and other historians have speculated this too, that she may have been a healer. Why? There's a few reasons why for me. I can't speak to what other historians like why Richard Ross, who wrote a book about the Connecticut witch trials, about why he assumed this. But I think it's a probability because you have someone being blamed during an epidemic. And the most likely person to be blamed is a healer whose remedies are not working. But it's beyond that. The first case usually sets a pattern for later cases, at least some parts of the pattern. And the second person hanged for witchcraft is Margaret Jones in Boston, Massachusetts. Why was she hanged? We have this on the record. She was hanged because they found her to be a malignant healer. John Winthrop Sr. in his journal says people recoil from her touch. But the other reason why I think, and this is more definitive for me, about why Alice Young may have been a healer is that I was trying to trace, who she was. What was her identity before she got married? And I literally went through every single Alice I could find in colonial records. I had like a 3-page long list. And when I looked at each Alice, that, they settled somewhere else. They were connected to other families. It was pretty easy to go through. Yep. No, never heard from her again. Oh yeah, she's married this family, this family, this family. And by process of elimination, I eliminated all of them except for one in Cambridge. And her name was Alice Ashby. Well, I tried to go to Cambridge to see if there were any birth records for Alice Jr., to see if there was a marriage record for Alice and John Young. Didn't find it. The historical society there said we don't have these original records anymore, which is a shame. But they were around in the 1800s because someone in the late 1800s wrote a book and included early property records. And when I saw this book, I thought, okay, there may be something to this. They're on a street, it's identified quite clearly that there's a young household next to a Holman household. Now, the Holmans are significant because the one Alice that I found, Alice Ashby, that I could connect to a tinker, remember how I said she was living amongst the tinkers? I could connect that family as knowing John Tinker. And anyway, that person, Alice Ashby, was a maidservant to the Holmans. And the matriarch of that family, Winifred Holman, had been accused of witchcraft later on, and she had been a healer, practicing herbal medicine. And we have it well documented that Winifred Holman was accused of witchcraft and why. So if Alice Ashby, who worked for Winifred Holman, was under her tutelage as a maidservant, she could have learned about herbal medicine. She could have learned about healing. Plus, there's the tinker connection. But that final piece that made me think, I do think this is the right person, was that the Young and the Holmans having the maidservant, Alice Ashby, lived right next door to each other in Cambridge. Yet, I can't prove it because we don't have those records from Cambridge. However, and this is another piece of it, there is what do you call it? There's marriage records of New England. There's a book about this. And in the book, there's something about John and Alice. No last name. There's another one about Young. No other last name. It's in this data that someone collected about marriages in New England. I think that's the name of the book, actually. But so there's this last little link about who she was. But all of that ties in together along with the fears of the time to make Alice Young a target.
It's so great to hear about your research and to hear about those lives. And it's really exciting to consider the possibilities.
Absolutely. And I know we're there at one point because someone from the 1800s was looking at them. So maybe they'll show up again. I mean, the Matthew Grant diary, where those vital statistics are, and early Windsor Church record, it's mostly lectures in there. That wasn't found until the late 1800s. So you never know. We didn't even know Alice Young's name until that showed up in a pile of rubble. It turns out Matthew Grant's great granddaughter or something like that still owned his house in Windsor, and it was torn down. And there was stuff in it when it was torn down, including that book, believe it or not. And so some kid is walking through the rubble and he sees this book. Oliver Ellsworth homestead is right nearby. So it was an Ellsworth child was walking around, and Oliver Ellsworth is famous for being on the Supreme Court at one time, years later. So this kid sees this book and brings it to his dad, and the dad says, oh, I think that might be something really important. Let's bring it to the minister. The minister is like, oh, wow, yeah. We should show this to the state historian at the time. James Hammond Trumbull looks at it, and he finds on the inside cover, Alice Young hanged May 26-47. And again, remember, this is being written in the Julian calendar, but we know he's writing in the 1600s, so that's why it's -47. And actually, he found the Carringtons there. as witch hanging victims too. So that was a huge piece of information that told us a lot. And so if we could just find another seemingly little piece of information about Alice Ashby and John Young marriage record or the birth of Alice Young Jr., it might lead us to a lot more.
I want to hear too about how Governor Winthrop Jr. was connected to some people in Alice's life.
Yeah, this was so interesting. It kind of blew me away. And this might be another reason why Alice was targeted. There were things going on politically. The group from Dorchester, Mass. They were originally from southwest of England, Dorchester, England. They followed their minister to Massachusetts, founded the town of Dorchester, Mass. Roger Ludlow, who you hear about in other witch trial stories too, he led the group from Massachusetts into Windsor. And why did he do that? Well, he was pissed off because he lost the election for governor to John Winthrop Sr., and he hated the Winthrops. He really did. And I don't think they liked him. He was obnoxious, really obnoxious. He gets credit for the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. He was a lawyer. He wrote some good stuff, but he was the one who later moved to Stratford, Fairfield area and ends up trying to accuse women of witchcraft there, Mary Staples. So anyway, he's in Windsor at the time of Alice Young's accusation, and he's kind of in the hate Winthrop crowd. So who do you have with the Tinkers? The Tinker family. One really important person in the Tinker family, the only remaining son, is named John Tinker. And he actually worked for the Winthrops. He worked for Winthrop Sr. and he worked for Winthrop Jr. His allegiance for years until his death was working for the Winthrops. It's so interesting. We know he was a really trusted person of John Winthrop Jr. because it's well documented that Jr. actually sent him to his good friend to pick up alchemical books and alchemical supplies and bring them directly to Winthrop Jr. So he was important in that way. But later on, like when John Winthrop Jr. leaves Connecticut for England to get the charter for Connecticut, guess who's handling all the Indian treaties? I mean, I have to go through this more, but not a couple years ago, I found a Native American treaty. And who's there in John Winthrop Jr.'s stead signing this treaty? It's John Tinker. His movement follow John Winthrop Jr.'s, and he's strong in the Winthrop camp, right? And he also owns a huge piece of land in Windsor, which rivals anything that Roger Ludlow has as well. Could have been like a political piece to this as well. The people who ended up staying in town were indeed, even though Roger Ludlow left, a lot of people from Dorchester, England, were the ones that ended up staying. And the history always told in Windsor is about the Mary and John, the ship that all of those people came on. So,
Yeah. You touched on John Winthrop Jr.'s alchemical beliefs. He had a number of beliefs in his worldview that were a little bit different than some of the other thinkers in New England at the time. How did his beliefs in things like alchemy affect his interactions with the witchcraft accusations?
what he practiced and what others thought he practiced was high magic. And we're talking about it. I want to recommend a book, Prospero's America, It's by Walter Woodward. It's an intense read, a lot of references, but he's the one who really looks into John Winthrop Jr.'s alchemical beliefs and how they intersected with stopping the witch trials. Basically, he was someone who followed this ancient philosophy, and alchemy aimed to achieve basically purification of the soul, right? But they did that through not just spiritual work, but also through the idea of changing lead into gold. That was a metaphor for spiritual transformation. The person with sin transforming themselves to be more pure. And so, because of all these experiments with trying to turn lead into gold, they learned a lot about different elements, and alchemy became the very beginnings of chemistry. So, what you would see in a chemical lab now, like some of the smoke and colors, things like that, the explosions, whatever, we know now from being students in chemistry, at least at one point in time, and having to go to chemistry labs, that things happen that can appear magical, but they're not. They're natural. It's a natural science. And so Winthrop was starting to learn about this. This was the very beginnings of enlightenment. Really started with a lot of people who studied alchemy. And so he realized that what these witch trial victims were accused of, they couldn't do. They couldn't do as human beings. He still believed in witchcraft. All of them believed in witchcraft, but he looked at it a little more logically. And Winthrop was called upon in some of the earlier witch trials in Connecticut as an expert. At the time, he wasn't a governor yet, but he was an expert in alchemy, which they thought was high magic. And he was also a doctor of alchemical medicine. So because of that expertise, they would call him into witch trials and they would ask him, do you think this person truly did witchcraft? Or was this person bewitched because Mary over here bewitched her? Or was it because of something that had to do with a medical reason? And every single time he got called into a case, he would say, no, it's not witchcraft. It's something else. I understand if you're perturbed with this person in your community, maybe they don't act right according to how you think they should behave or whatever, being rude, or in the case of women, they really were looked down upon if they spoke their mind or stuck up for themselves or were more assertive. But he would say, but that doesn't mean they're a witch. And every time he got involved, the person, they were not convicted.
The high magic was not diabolical, whereas the women's perceived magic, they were determining that it must be diabolical magic.
Right. Yeah, there were basically three kinds of magic at the time. And Woodward talks about this in his book. The high magic was the learned men of Hartford. They were studying alchemy there. He and other wealthy, learned men would study this. And so it had to be okay. It couldn't have anything to do with the demon because it was their group. The people who decided the rules were studying alchemy. So, of course, it was going to be okay. Then, common folk, what did they believe in? They believed in magic. Everybody believed in magic. And they practiced magic to a certain degree, too, with a horseshoe over the door or good luck stenciling of a mason into a fireplace. It's like we do good luck charm things now. Watching sports games, that's where you see the most superstition, the most common magic now is people turning their hats around to get their team to rally, wearing the same shirt over and over again without washing it so their team will win the championship. Those are examples of folk magic, right? And that didn't necessarily get you in trouble. What got you in trouble is if the folk magic happened at a time where a bad thing happened, like all these deaths next door. It was normally just a little thing. The ministers probably didn't like it, but it wasn't considered diabolical until really strange things started happening.
Thank you so much for joining us again today. This has been a real pleasure. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to make sure you had a chance to cover?
I encourage people come to my Facebook page. That's where most everything is. I'm very bad about newsletters. I have a list, but I don't do newsletters too often. But come to the Facebook page. That's where you're going to find the most information. The article on Connecticut History Review. Go to my website, One of Windsor. That's where you will find the absolute most information. There's a bunch of interviews there. I will put this interview there, the link to this interview as well. And check out the Connecticut Witch Trial Trilogy. If you love the history, but you don't like going through all the dry facts, it kind of brings it to life. The biggest thing is to remember how these trials started and that they were an injustice, and these mentalities, they carry on. Now the people being targeted, at least in this country, are immigrants. In other countries, they're targeted for other reasons, but they still go on. And we need to increase awareness about these things and really think about how gossip and targeting people does great harm.
Thank you so much. I love that we're able to dive in and talk through the records that are there and the stories. It really shows you that this history has been concealed or untold, but it is the history that was there. It comes out of the communities that are part of the colonial history. And it's really easy to see them as people when we're able to talk about them and to really just picture that colonial life. And it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened alongside the rest of the history. So thank you.
Beth, thank you for such an excellent discussion and for bringing this history to life in such a powerful way.
Thank you for your work on the Connecticut Witch Memorial Facebook page, the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project, and with the nonprofit End Witch Hunts.
Everyone, don't forget that this week was the launch of the Thing About Salem podcast. You don't want to miss it. So download the first episode, The Thing About Tituba, today. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.